Hello and welcome to our AIB Journals webinar latest edition. Today we have a very special session featuring research that happened 10 years ago and has been updated now with several commentaries and reflection papers that are coming out in the January issue of JIBS. As most of you probably know, the webinar series has been started last May, 8 months ago now almost, and the purpose is to share the research that is published in one of our publications, Journal of International Business Studies, Journal of International Business Policy. And we want to use the opportunities of modern technology to discuss about the research and also to share our reflections, discuss policy implications, managerial implications, and directions for future research. Let me first give thanks to the people who have helped making this happen. As I said, this is a collaboration of both of the journals, although today we're focusing on JIBS. Both of those journals are under the Academy of International Business. This webinar series has been initiated by Tim Deviney and myself, who have been running it since, and I especially appreciate the technology support provided by the AIB Secretariat, specifically Tunga Kiak, as well as Renfei Gao at University of Manchester. Today, we have 3 papers. As I said, it's more reflection type papers over the Decade Award. I should say the Decade Award within our community is probably the most prestigious, the most aspired award that we have, because it features a research that has been shown to have made an impact over a period of 10 years. And I'm very pleased that today we get the opportunity to discuss with some of the original authors, as well as other people who have done research in the same area since, to reflect over where the research is going. Now, this webinar is designed as an interactive activity, so please use the Q&A function to ask your questions. We will not use the chat for communications. We focus on the Q&A. Input your questions to the Q&A, and you can also use the Q&A to vote questions up, which means our co-moderator today will be able to see it, and she will then select questions and ask them to the audience. May I introduce my co-host today, which is Christina Gibson, who is at Pepperdine University in California. And yes, sitting in Canada, I'm jealous about the sunshine you get even in January. But Cristina, of course, is rather than knowing for sunshine, well, you also have a lot of sunshine in your face. But mainly, of course, Cristina is known for being a distinguished scholar who's done a lot of work on human resource management. Cristina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Klaus. And thank you to Tim and Renfei and Tunga for helping to make this session possible. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today. Günter, Martha, Stacey, Piers. As you all know, cultural diversity and inclusion are topics that are really near and dear to my heart. And we're so fortunate today to have several of the top scholars in the world on these topics with us here today. Cultural diversity is no longer an option or a choice. It's a reality in organizations and societies all around the world. Yet cultural diversity has long been recognized as a double-edged sword or a mixed blessing in work teams. Diversity can be a source of friction and conflict, representing a really daunting obstacle to effective team functioning. But it can also be a source of synergy and learning, a powerful seed that can grow into something new and innovative. Interestingly, and increasingly, scholars and practitioners are recognizing the importance of the link between cultural diversity and what scholars are referring to as divergent processes. And these lead to both process gains, but also process losses. Divergent processes create gains by enhancing creativity and can enhance team outcomes such as innovation and creativity. Yet divergent processes introduce variety. So that can mean disagreement, and it can therefore possibly decrease team performance. So the most recent work on cultural diversity acknowledges the psychological and the social mechanisms that through which culture plays a role, and the effect of cultural diversity is going to be context dependent. This was really expertly documented in the paper published by Günter Stahl, Martha Maznevski, Andreas Voigt, and Karsten Johnson in 2010, published in the Journal of International Business Studies, and it was entitled Unraveling the Effects of Cultural Diversity in Teams, a meta-analysis of research on multicultural teams. This is the paper that won the 2020 GIBS Decade Award. I must say that I personally was really incredibly thrilled when I heard that this paper had won, because it's been very influential in my own work and thinking about the topic of cultural diversity. So building on this important work, this webinar is going to discuss the progress of research on culturally diverse teams. We pose the questions, have we learned? What have we learned about processes in culturally diverse teams? How do contextual features influence these processes? What are the implications for practice? And what research questions do we need to investigate in order to understand this phenomenon more deeply? So I will now turn it over to Günter and Martha's reflections on their award-winning paper. But first, it gives me great pleasure to introduce these two wonderful friends of mine. First, Günter Stahl, Professor of International Management and co-director of the Center for Sustainability, Transformation, and Responsibility, otherwise known as STAR, at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. His current research interests include corporate social responsibility and irresponsibility, grand societal challenges and their implications for international business and management, and the changing nature of global work. And Martha Maznevski, Professor of Organizational Behavior and Faculty Co-Director of the IB Academy at IB Business School, Western University, London, Canada. Her current research interests are in cross-boundary collaboration and cross-country collaboration, global leadership, broad application of cross-cultural competencies to increase equity, diversity, and inclusion. And Martha is also the founder of the International Organizational Network and one of my longest and dearest friends in the field. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Martha and Günter, and they will now present their reflections paper entitled Unraveling the Effects of Cultural Diversity in Teams, a retrospective of research on multicultural work group and an agenda for future research. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody, and a big thanks to our hosts, Klaus, Meyer, and Chris Gibson for their introductory comments. Now, since Martha and I have only 10 minutes for this presentation, let me plunge straight in by giving you an overview of the theoretical model and the key finding from our meta-analysis. And I will then hand over to Martha, who will talk about how this field, team diversity research, has evolved since our 2010 paper came out. And she will also outline some future directions for research. Now, our point of departure in this study was the now widely accepted notion that cultural diversity is a double-edged sword for teams. As Chris just pointed out, diversity can be a source of friction and conflict and an obstacle to effective team functioning, certainly, but it can also be an asset to a team, a source of synergy and learning, depending on factors that were poorly understood. Next slide, please, and underexplored in team diversity research at the time we embarked on this study, as evidenced by these quotes. And as we set out to explore these unidentified factors that influence processes and outcomes in diverse teams, we realized how little we actually knew about the mechanisms underlying the effects of cultural diversity in teams. And we started to develop some theoretical ideas, many of them actually based on Chris' work about the boundary conditions under which diversity may contribute positively or negatively to team outcomes, and also potential mediating mechanisms. Next slide, please, Martha. This is the conceptual framework that guided our meta-analysis in line with social identity theory and other theoretical perspectives, information processing theory. We proposed that cultural diversity increases divergent processes in teams, leading to both process gains and process losses. Now, a divergent process that creates process gain is creativity, to give one example. One that creates a process loss is interpersonal conflict or miscommunication, and conversely, we propose that cultural diversity decreases convergent processes in teams. Convergent processes are those that provide integration and cohesion and align the team around common goals and values. Like divergent processes, some convergent processes contribute positively to team performance, for example, social integration and trust. And some can hinder effective team performance, for example, by making the group close to dissent and vulnerable to groupthink, right? So the basic underlying premise of our framework is that cultural diversity does not have a direct impact on team performance, but rather that the effect is indirect, mediated by process variables such as creativity, cohesion, and conflict. We propose that the extent to which the process gains can be maximized and the process losses be minimized will depend on characteristics such as team tenure, the complexity of the task, whether the team is co-located or geographically dispersed, and so on. And from this framework, we developed a set of hypotheses, next slide please, relating cultural diversity to intermediate outcomes and specifying moderator effects. We did not formulate a hypothesis linking cultural diversity to overall team performance because, as I just explained, the basic idea behind the framework is that process gains and process losses may partially or fully offset one another, so that the overall impact on team performance will be, well, not necessarily zero, but will be impossible to predict. And consistent with this logic, the meta-analytic results showed that overall performance was unrelated to diversity. The mean effect size was 0. And as hypothesized, we found that cultural diversity is associated with enhanced creativity, greater potential for conflict, reduced communication effectiveness. The effect was non-significant, but in the predicted direction. Greater team member satisfaction, not lower satisfaction as we have predicted, and lower cohesion or social integration. And unfortunately, we couldn't test the hypothesis that diverse teams are less prone to groupthink because we found only one study that tested this relationship. And the subgroup analysis revealed that aspects of the team context moderate the effects of cultural diversity on team outcomes, but not always in the predicted direction. For example, we found that geographically dispersed teams tend to have less conflict and more social integration than co-located teams, which seemed a bit counterintuitive to us. Certainly not what we had expected, but there's some evidence that being co-located can actually increase the potential for conflict in a team. So just to illustrate that, although the meta-analytic results mostly supported the theoretical model, there were some unexpected findings that raised important questions about the dynamics of culturally diverse teams, questions that are as relevant today in a post-COVID, well, hopefully soon post-COVID-19 world as they were 10 years ago when this article came out. Like the question, could it be that a virtual or remote team context actually makes it easier, not harder, to create a climate of inclusion and reduce dysfunctional cultural clashes in the team, and other important questions? Over to you, Martha.
Sorry, had to unmute there. Thank you. Thanks very much, Günter, and thanks for the lovely introductions, Klaus and Cristina. It was the doctoral consortium where we first met, Cristina. So those of you who are PhD students, those doctoral consortiums, relationships that last a long time, huh? So when Günter and I, when we wrote this paper, we were excited about it as well, but we didn't know that it would have this much impact. And so it was really interesting to look back at that impact. I want to reflect on two things. One is the decade of progress. And Stacey is also going to be talking about that in the paper that she did with Dana and Chris. So I'll just touch on a couple of the highlights here. Our main recommendation was to fine-tune our understanding of mediators and moderators. moderators, that we shouldn't talk so much about just the relationship between diversity and performance anymore, but really focus on those mediators and moderators. And first of all, we're just really glad to see that the field takes this for granted now, that cultural diversity has both positive and negative effects. And so there is a lot of research now that focuses on both the how and the when. And at the same time, there's been a lot of research on teams in the organizational behavior field that has developed the input process output model, or input mediators output model, with reciprocation a lot more. And we could see the evidence of both of those things coming together in the research on multicultural teams. So a lot of work on processes, especially creativity and communication, including language. A lot of really interesting work on contextual moderators, especially the moderator virtuality, as Günter said. And some interesting research on individual level inputs. And I think this is, aside from the mediators, this is where some of the really big strides have been made. For example, around cross-cultural competences and cultural intelligence, and how having those competences inside a team in different configurations help the team manage the processes to get to the outcomes. Multicultural and n-cultural individuals, Stacey's work and others here, having those competences in the team makes a big difference. And then a lot of studies too on the leader's behavior and the leader's competences. And for example, the finding that a transformational leader can make a big difference in getting the positives out of multicultural teams and decreasing the negatives. And then there have been some really good studies, and Chris's have been really exemplary here with the ones that she's done with different co-authors, combining different inputs, mediators, moderators to look at specific combinations and especially over time, and really giving us an insight to how these dynamics can unfold over time to get good performance. So some really, really good things there. And we also want to give a shout out to X-Culture for creating the equivalent of an undergrad psychology lab for us, where we can do early empirical tests of theories that really helps us so that when we get to the field work, we can do much more complicated things. So thanks for that. And then finally, we also, as we look at it, think that there's still a lot of things to learn. And we touch on three themes that we think are particularly important. The first is the nature of culture and cultural diversity in teams. Now, Stacey, I know, is going to be talking some more about this, but we also found it very clearly. We talked about surface and deep level because it was kind of the only way we could categorize what was out there. We're kind of shocked that it's still the main way that people categorize. There have been some ways of thinking about it more precisely, but we need more of that and more broadly. And we also think it's important to embrace intersectionality. Multicultural teams are rarely diverse just on culture. We had a finding in the study that we did not report in the JIBS article that multicultural teams that were also diverse on gender had lower performance. And we're not quite sure what we were picking up there, which is why we couldn't include it in the paper. It got too complicated, but we think there's a lot of work to be done on intersectionality of culture with other types of diversity and configurations. We also want to call out the IB field in general, that the findings from that cultural diversity and its effect on teams has progressed much faster than cultural diversity and its effect on other kinds of relationships in micro foundations and strategy and so on. And we think it would be really important for the rest of IB to take some of these explanations and theoretical mechanisms and apply them in much more sophisticated ways, for example, to things like post-merger integration, boundary spanning collaboration, lateral collaboration, foreign market entry effectiveness, and so on. And then finally, on the one hand, we think there should be more research on the positive effects of diversity. Still, the field really tends to focus on overcoming the negative effects. But at the same time, we wish practitioners would hear about the negative effects of diversity. We find it a little bit odd that most of the received wisdom in practice is that diversity is always good and cultural diversity is awesome. And there's this kind of notion that it's a double-edged sword is really not part of the narrative in practice. So on the one hand, we think there should be more research on how to attain the positive aspects and also greater dialogue with practice about the reality that it is this double-edged sword and how can we bring that sophistication into practice. So just in conclusion, this paper, like the research that we're studying, came together from the help of a lot of diverse people, and it's created for us and for other people, we're grateful, a lot of dialogue around that, and we hope that it continues to do so, and we really look forward to hearing from the other papers too.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Martha and Günter. I'm going to move right on to our next speaker. We have Stacey Fitzsimmons with us, joining us from Victoria, British Columbia. Stacey is an associate professor of international management at the Gustavin School of Business, University of Victoria, Canada. And her research also examines how multicultural and migrant employees contribute to their teams and organizations. And Stacey's groundbreaking work on multiculturalism continues to set the standard for understanding this phenomenon. I also want to give her a shout out for a special issue that she's co-editing of JIBS on global mobility. So if you're doing work in that space, please do consider submitting to that special issue, which I'm sure will be amazing with Stacey and Dana at the helm. All right, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Stacey, presenting Beyond the Double-Edged Sword of Culture, Diversity in Teams.
Thanks so much, Christina. Thanks for that lovely introduction. And yes, please do submit to our special issue. Klaus, I wonder if you could put the link in the chat so people can find it. So we've long admired this paper, and I was also thrilled to see it rewarded with this Decade Award. Now you're going to see quite a few parallels between what I say and what Martha has just said. I swear we didn't collaborate, but we clearly share some of the same ideas about what progress has been made and where we ought to go in the future. First of all, international business as a field has traditionally been a net importer of research and theories specifically from other fields. And this paper bucks the trend, right? So we did this. This is actually a Web of Science picture from last Thursday. We cited slightly different numbers in the paper because that was done in October. And what you see here is that this paper has been picked up across fields in a way that most international business research isn't. What you can't even see on this map is all the fields where it has a single citation. This reaches all the way to fields such as anesthesiology, aerospace engineering, religion, and surgery. And I followed through and read the citations in each of those papers to make sure they're legit, and they were. So why? Why did this paper have such broad appeal? And we think that it's two reasons, right? One is that compared to the current trend towards grand challenges in international business, this paper is almost mundane in its universality. Everyone has experienced cultural diversity in teams. Everyone has this feeling of both the benefits and the drawbacks. And so this paper, I think, resonates with everyone, no matter what field you're in. And the second reason is because it truly does have strong implications for both theory and practice. Right? Theoretically, it's become almost obligatory to mention process losses and gains if you're talking about anything to do with team diversity. And in terms of practice, the mediating variables are things that are really practically useful. Right? These are all things that are highly manageable, things like team tenure, team size, task complexity. These are all things that a manager could read and pick up and implement right away. So that's one, these are two of the reasons why we think this paper in particular has had such broad appeal beyond international business. But we really wanted to know then what kind of progress has been made. And so we looked at the papers citing this from A-level journals, and we classified what kinds of progress they were, or how they were using this paper. And we ended up concluding that there's been substantial progress in terms of what we call diversity in teams. And by that, we mean especially references to the double-edged sword and outcomes of team diversity. That there's been moderate progress in terms of the input process output logic. And by that, we're referring to things like mediating and moderating variables. And that there's been minimal progress in terms of defining cultural diversity. And that's not necessarily a problem, because this paper came at the end of a long period of really creative, generative ideas about how to define it. But as we'll say at the end, there is some suggestions that we really do want to move forward and move beyond this in the future. Overall, we'd say that because of in international business, because we have such a strong grounding in cross-cultural management, that we have a lot of understanding about how diversity works in teams. However, this may have actually held us back from examining the broader ideas about diversity in teams beyond international business as well. So moving right into it, and I'll go through each of those 3 types in turn. So in terms of diversity in teams, around 30% of the papers from A-level journals, when they cited Stahl et al., they were doing it in some way, shape, or form to refer to the double-edged sword, right? So this has become a very popular metaphor when it comes to diversity in teams. And we know a lot about this by now, right? We know, as Martha and Günter have already mentioned, right, that team diversity generally supports things like creativity and problem solving and knowledge generation, but that it can impede things like communication and efficiency. We also know that some of the processes that are involved, such as micro level processes through brokering and bridging between team members. However, we think that the double-edged sword metaphor, it naturally places diversity as antecedent, and that we are ready to move beyond this and really dig into primarily how diversity is managed, right? So as Cristina said at the introduction, right, diversity is our reality. So we don't need to really look at that as an antecedent or something to create. What we need to do is look at how it's managed. What are the organizational and managerial choices that improve the way that we handle diversity? We're looking at cross-level effects, things like how to transform individual human capital into team or firm-level outcomes. And more controversially, we also recommend that it may be time to retire the surface versus deep-level distinction. And we say this, the results that we've had from this distinction are substantial, and we want to continue to build on the results that have been found. However, referring to some levels, some types of diversity as surface level is inadvertently dismissive, right? It makes things what are often called surface level distinctions would be things related to demographics. And that these are no less important than diversity that comes from things like cultural values. So as an alternative, Vas, I see that you're here as well, right? They published a paper in 2019 where they referred to personal diversity, or diversity coming from personal factors and diversity from contextual factors. That may be one alternative, which is a more meaningful distinction. When it comes to input, process, output logic, we say that there has been moderate progress here, and we're referring to things like mediating and moderating effects. We now know that things like diversity climates and cultures can strengthen the relationship between team diversity and team performance. However, what we find is that a lot of the models remain fairly static, right? So they're looking cross-sectionally at one point in time, or that a lot of the papers citing Stahl et al., they did so as almost a superficial reference to the fact that cultural diversity matters in teams without really explaining why or how it matters. And so in the future, what we really are looking forward to seeing is more truly processual understanding. So moving from understanding teams as a static phenomenon or a noun, right, to teaming process as a verb. And especially as it unfolds over time. So for that, we would be looking at more longitudinal or qualitative research, and also looking at more contextual influences, right? So teams not in a vacuum, but teams within the context of their environment and social context. And then for the last one, defining cultural diversity. As I said, this paper came near the end of a period of really interesting new developments. And I know Cristina was one of the editors of a special issue looking at new theoretical ways to conceptualize diversity, right? So we have had progress, and that one came in the last decade. We have had progress where models are now becoming slightly more embedded, more dynamic, less reliant on values as the primary definition of cultural diversity, and also more sensitive to levels issues. Around 14% of the papers citing Stahl et al. Did so to basically define cultural diversity. However, what we find is that despite the obligatory mention that culture is not the same as nationality, that it continues to dominate, right? And that's not surprising for international business because country continues to be a really relevant division for international business, but it is surprising that other things such as race and religion and language aren't more dominant, which are also really relevant in international business. And also information variety is almost always used as the explanation for cultural diversity, where people have different information and they join together in a team. And so knowledge sharing is then the common mechanism. So we ended up concluding that the cultural diversity literature is actually not particularly diverse in its conceptualization or theoretical mechanisms. So in the future, what we suggest is that we suggest first that things like variety or separation could be really an alternative ways to conceptualize diversity in teams. For example, Wren, Gray, and Harris in 2015, they conceptualized diversity in teams in terms of attitude separation, status disparity, and information variety. And they were able to use that to explain social network composition effects, right? So that's a very different way of doing it. But then finally, that we would want to see a wider variety of diversity categories, right? So things like age, gender, physical abilities, joining up with the broader equity, diversity, and inclusion research, where they're making great progress, and combining that with our expertise on cultural diversity. In conclusion, we think that in international business, we have a deep expertise in understanding how diversity works in teams, and that we ought to be a leader in creating the next radical traveling theory and explaining diversity's effects beyond international business as well.
Thank you, Stacey. Such an interesting commentary. I love your opening slide with the breakdown of all the various different areas that have drawn upon Martha and Günter and their team's work. That's so impressive. All right, let's move on to our very last speaker, Piers, who will talk about the methodology of meta-analysis and what we can and cannot infer from this type of study. Piers is a professor in organizational behavior and human resource management and is the Brookfield Research Chair at the Haskayne School of Business. He's a recognized authority on the science of motivation and is known internationally for his work also on productivity. He has expertise in systematic review and meta-analysis, and he's published over 25 articles on the topic. So I'm looking forward to hear what he has to say about the new and evolving trends in meta-analysis approaches. Piers, over to you.
You're muted.
There we go. And I was warned about that too. Make sure you unmute. Yeah, you always sound good when you get to write your own introduction. I enjoyed that. Myself, Short, and Herman, we actually went over this one and we found it really, really interesting. I would describe this as a liminal paper in terms of like halfway through a moment. It's kind of ushering in a new moment. The model still holds up. Its application to all these really important topics that we have, and that's the only thing that's become almost dominant in our culture right now. Our concerns of diversity. We're seeing the effects of tribalism, of course, in the United States and around the world, as a social justice topic. This is really kind of what we're kind of focusing on, and including the problems of the different varieties of diversity can be, including when you consider intersectionality, is almost infinite. Some people get around that by looking at perceived diversity as a summary variable, so we can actually kind of move forward. But it's just, this was the right paper at the right time. Now, given that, is it going to go forward? Given that, there's a lot of steps to a meta-analysis, of which we really can't review all 24 in the next 9 minutes, right? That is a little bit much. But important thing is that many of these steps have been reconsidered, reconceptualized, and improved over the last dozen years. Now, when we actually go and actually assess Stahl's paper, we gave them a grade, but I must say, full disclosure, my own articles at the time would probably get a similar grade. So this is just represents there was a depth for the time, but we're kind of going in towards the future. And the same type of way that they have launched and really kind of made an entirely new body of research to summarize. And being a liminal paper, there are kind of areas which have now changed and moved on. There are kind of basic background literature search. We got the data set, they shared it with us. We recoded it, we found it really well done. But today we want a lot of, as we say, transparency regarding it, knowing exactly what search terms. You should be able to actually take the data and redo it yourself and get the exact same results. That's really rare. So, but it was largely replicable. When we get to data preparation, a little bit lower, mostly because they didn't actually look for outliers, which is becoming a more common step. Now, actually, some of those outliers did in fact influence their results. In fact, when you take away, it actually kind of hinges on whether their creativity association is robust or not. So back then, you might be lucky if you have one outlier analysis. Now there's like 6 or 7 you can easily kind of tap. It's really kind of become a rather bigger thing. In terms of effect sizes, great average effect size, I have no problem there. But in terms of heterogeneity and reporting it and determining using a fixed versus random effects model. Random effects model believes there's moderators. And if you actually add that, it expands the size of your credibility intervals, confidence intervals, essentially around some of your results. And it slips some into non-significance. So you actually have to kind of consider outliers and this to actually recover the creativity. So in one case, the expanded heterogeneity means that their creativity association doesn't stay robust, but if you take away an outlier, it gets returned. So you recover it, but there's a lot of kind of chop going on in there. And then finally, you have transparency and replicability. And it's going to be, it's pretty good. They gave me some of the stuff. Not all the steps were documented. Now, again, I'm going to say this applies equally to my own at the time. But you could get the data sets and you recover most of the choice. Today, we want to see everything more in an open science framework. So when you put it through this, I'm kind of arguing this I'm trying to convince them that this is so current. The methodology has changed enough, right? The research base has expanded. It's going to affect the impact. They really should do an update, right? It's now basic time. Average time in medical sciences for an update is about every 4 years. So we're much slower. And in the areas like this, which are exploding, and important areas like this, need to actually be reconsidered. So again, and this is actually I want to kind of talk about some of the effects, some of the outcomes we can do if we start kind of going back and considering some updates to these kind of classic meta-analyses, these and other classic meta-analyses. One is, again, there's been a whole bunch of new statistical methods we can kind of put at this. As I mentioned, there was many new outlier analyses. They use fail-safe-n as a publication bias analysis, one that I've used, but it's now no longer recommended. There's so many better techniques available that taking a look at it, we now can actually kind of see whether something's amiss or not. There's better moderator detection techniques, ones that are aggression-based. They use a new Harting NAP technique, which is, again, an improvement. There's new kind of structural equation modeling, which when you combine with moderator techniques, in my opinion, opens up an entire new era of science. Now, this, though, alone would actually justify a new one. Now, for almost all of us, can only have the pretense of keeping up in our fields. We have to be very judicious about what we read because it's publishing far, far faster than we can reading. So the orange line is increase in meta-analyses, and it's continued on. It's growing exponential. But also the increase. Back in the 1970s when it started, there was really only like a 250,000. Now it's up to about 4 million papers in the Web of Science alone, not including conference papers and all the rest of them. And you might consider like an exaflood of information. Now, to actually handle this, there have been some new tools along these particular lines. Covenants, for example, is one we actually have a license for at a university. It's from the Cochrane collaboration, and it's designed to help kind of filter your material down to it. Distiller, for example, is one that is designed to actually help kind of actually code the software, and HubMeta tries to do both. So there is kind of an explanation that the actual number of articles that we have nowadays can no longer be handled by traditional means. So once you have this, though, some really remarkable things open up. These two elements, when put together, is almost like the CRISPR of our field, basically our revolution. And one is, of course, being able to predict what a correlation would be in a given situation. That's when you have the moderators down. So you know when it's high or low. So you know, for example, when creativity is going to be increased with a certain type of diversity. So this type of diversity could maybe be a positive correlation, this other type of diversity, a negative one. That's a mark of mature science. And when you can put it together in a structural equation model, you can make customized predictive equations. So now become incredibly practical. We can make specific advice to specific teams based upon science. It is the final step towards a complete basic element. Now, the only thing after that is experimental work, which actually allows us to actually kind of improve in outcomes. Now, this used to be something that would take about 3 years to do. A couple years ago, we actually did it in an afternoon. And I tried it out this morning again, and I can do it in about 40 seconds, right? That's the new line of meta-analysis, that we can create these correlations. And this is basically the number of studies that was done and the average sample size. So with that, for example, and this is just one example, I could have used it to predict job performance for any particular job. And then if it was rolled out nationwide, this is basically effective GDP. Now, that's just an example. We could have used similar type of techniques to actually get mean-based for HOSI, to update our cultural elements instead of relying on 1967. Notice it ends in 2000s, though. This one, again, 2000s. It was combined again. I used it to combine it again with some other stats. They get a nice correlation matrix, but new data from the analysis. We'll skip that one. The problem is, though, keeping them up to date. And this goes back to Stahl. When we have an area that's exploding like this and new, we need to get this information in a way and almost want to create a living systematic review where it's more, instead of having this one and done, we have it more where it's kind of periodically revisited, or a team that's supposed to be expecting to revisit it every 5 years. We also need to actually consider taxonomy and ontology to make sure we're all saying the same language. When we talk about creativity, are we talking about problem solving or the artistic creativity? They make a big difference between those two. And our language, surface versus deep, or demographic versus psychographic. If we're not using the same language, very difficult to make it cumulative. So, and final slide is that really, as a liminal moment, it's the end of one area, one era, but also beginning of another. That from this, it launches an entire new science, an entire new way. And we actually had a really exciting moment of science where we can get new conclusions, powerful conclusions, if we just kind of consider what's now possible. All right, thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Piers. I feel like we're explorers out there searching new planetary horizons. This is amazing. Thank you for the remarks from all of our distinguished panelists. We now are going to open up the discussion to the questions from our audience members. We've had some wonderful questions posed by the members of the audience. I will say that in general, the most common theme across these questions pertains to intersectionality and related issues. The combination of the variety of differences that can be represented on teams. This is what seems to be top of mind for many of our folks in the audience. So we'll start with a question from Liang Li. This is in particular asking about the combination of differences in organizational cultures and national cultures. So this person is asking, if we have a team of members from different functions or departments, or even from different companies, the mix of their own organizational cultures may play a very important role alongside national, let's say, cultural differences. So maybe Martha or Günter, if you want to take a stab at that to begin with, and maybe Stacey, you might have some follow-up comments as well.
Okay, I'll jump in. Günter hasn't unmuted yet. I'm faster on the unmute button. No, it's a great question, and thank you very much, everybody, for all the papers and the discussion and great questions. On intersectionality and the multiple cultures, I mean, of course, different cultures are going to affect what's going on. I find it, for my own work, I find it helpful to go back to my undergrad in anthropology and kind of think about functional anthropology and a couple of things. You know, culture is a group. You can't have a culture by yourself. So if we're talking about individual differences, those are diversity as well, but they're not cultures. But anything where we've got a group that has shared values and some kind of common identity as a group can be a culture. So for example, I've done some really fun things looking at generations as cultures, Gen X or millennials or boomers as cultures, because you can talk about values and a sense of identity. And then if you look at functional culture, the functions of cultures, culture really provides two things. It provides efficiency and identity. And so then you can look at, in a particular team situation, every team member is a member of multiple cultures. They're a member of perhaps a religious culture, a national culture, maybe an ethnic culture, an organizational culture, a functional culture. And so then you can start to look at when which cultures become salient to which person, which means then you've got to look at the context as well. And I do think we've got the tools to do that. We're not doing it yet. And then the relationship between culture-based types of diversity and other sources of diversity that are not around kind of groups of identity. So that's not an answer. It's kind of a, yes, I agree. And I think there are tools for looking at it. And I would love to see us looking at those questions more and more rigorously.
Stacey, did you have some additional comment there?
No, I don't think so, but I think it looks like Günter does.
Ah, Günter.
Yeah, I do. I just can't find the raise hands function.
Oh, sorry.
On Zoom. I'm sorry for that. So, you know, I agree with Mark. Excellent question. And I thought Stacey, but because it also raises the issue of intersectionality, right? Or how different diversity sources combine and interact, would be in a better position to answer probably. But it reminded me also of my work on the role of culture and cultural differences in M&A, where I looked at interaction between national culture and organizational culture. And for instance, my org science paper, also another meta-analysis. And what we found, to our big surprise, was that in an M&A context, cross-border M&A, actually national cultural differences seem to have less of an impact on outcomes than differences in organizational culture, which, you know, initially we found kind of counterintuitive. At least it was not what we expected, but it makes complete sense because in cross-border joint ventures and M&A, of course, national culture is much more salient. And people are more attentive to cultural differences and expect cultural differences at the national level to have a huge impact, whereas differences in organizational culture are often invisible to the people, or at least you don't expect them to have such a huge impact. And now, in a team context, there is some research, I think, on the interaction of national culture and organizational culture. I'm thinking of Aida Hyros and her co-authors AMJ paper, for instance, looking at diverse team context. But I think much more work is needed, really, to look at how different diversity sources interact and combine to influence outcomes, because virtually all global teams, differ not only in terms of national cultures, but very often, there are gender differences in people's functional, professional backgrounds, and so on. And there's not enough research out there, I think, on these questions.
Thank you. Any other panelists want to chime in on issues of intersectionality, cultural differences that pertain to organizational cultures or other sources of identity? Piers?
Yeah, I think Vash Terrace actually also posed a question. When we did a paper on this, I think it was about 6% of the variance can be explained at the national level, which means the rest of it, of course, it's going to be with companies, and even within companies, the subgroups. The accounting department is going to have a different culture than the human resource department, and then you go down right to the individual. At some point, the diversity gets down to the individual. You are yourself, right? So we're looking for interesting, breaks in it, or what Plato would say, carving the universe at its joints. So kind of terrible imagery, but I get what he means. This is still something that we're going through, but yes. I mean, things like the gravitational hypothesis, we tend to pull together into like groups. And there are certain elements that are going to make it a little bit more so than others. I think that if we continue doing this with Zoom, it's going to actually intensify new pockets and new kind of like subcultures, and there's going to be a decreasing influence from corporations as a whole.
Thank you, Piers. Yeah, I will chime in a little bit there too. Some of the recent work that Jen Gibbs and I and others have been doing in very complex teams that have multiple sources of differences represented, drawing upon some of the literature in social identity that addresses the activation of different identities, that certain identities will become salient in certain circumstances, can be helpful. We found in some of our data that even differences in regional differences within a country that maybe coincide with specific aspects of the given context, for example, a refinery, and the degree to which it has recently had technology overhaul. If it has the most up-to-date operational resources, it may in fact be a source of identity, and the affiliation with that refinery essentially is a stronger source of pride and viewpoint and input into the team than would be the national cultural differences or even organizational cultural differences. So these are very fine-grained questions that we're starting to address, and drawing upon some of the bodies of knowledge and research in our sister fields of cross-cultural psychology and social psychology, I think can be really helpful in teasing out and understanding when the various identities will in fact be activated. We have quite a few other questions that are related. For example, really interesting set of ideas and comments from Vas Taras, asking us to think about as a panel and as an audience to think about whether it really matters the direction of cultural differences, is the way that he put it, or directionality of cultural differences. And the examples that he has provided here are, is it possible that young people have an easier time working with old people than the other way around? Or is it possible that men have an easier time working with women than the other way around? Very controversial examples there, Vas. But the larger question of considering how inputs or biases or perspectives coincide with these differences and how they will play out in the team, I think is where Vas is going with this. So I'll stop there. And Stacey, do you have any comment on the directionality of differences as Vas is referring to?
Yeah, thanks, Christina. Thanks, Vas. And also others have touched on similar ideas, right? And I think that this is a really exciting direction for the future. It's one area where we can combine with the research being done in EDI, right? Equity, diversity, and inclusion. For example, there's a paper in 2018, I'll put it in the chat, but they found that minority status in the home country actually turned into an advantage when people migrated, right? Because they had developed some skills that they were able to use as part of their acculturation process. And that's a directionality. I think that in international business, some of the things that so far we don't do enough of is addressing things like stigma, power dynamics, status differentials, right? And these are all directional phenomena where one person might have more status than another. We often look at differences as though they're equal, right? This is just different. But that's not really how the world works. And so I think that's something that I'm really excited to see more of in the future.
Thank you. Günter, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I do actually, because this is something that I feel about really strongly, the necessity of considering direction in work on culture in IB. And I mean, Oded Shenkar, I think it was 2000 in an award-winning CHIPS Decade Award-winning paper, he talked about, the fact that, he called it the illusion of asymmetry, that, the relationships are not symmetrical. The challenges facing a Nigerian immigrant in Denmark are quite different from the one facing a Danish immigrant in Nigeria. So we see this in all domains of IB research, these asymmetries. This is why I have stopped using cultural distance indices, because they ignore it. And in fact, I'm currently working with some colleagues trying to design cultural distance indices that consider directionality. And I think that's absolutely crucial that we do that.
Thank you, Günter. I agree. Extending on this discussion of types of differences, we've got a couple of questions around how others perceive our differences in contrast to how we ourselves might self-identify. So Sarah Koo, for example, says, can you speak to the concern of self-reporting demographics or diversity measurements and disparities in terms of how individuals are perceived? For example, an individual may self-identify as African from Algeria, yet is perceived by her context as white and therefore experiences life very differently from a self-identified African who is Black. Related to that is another question further down on the list about stereotypes and how those outside of ourselves might view our differences in a way that actually has a negative bias, right, leading to stereotypes, whereas others may see it as a positive source of difference. So that's a tough question. Who might want to jump in and tackle that one? Stacey.
Yeah, thanks so much for asking that question. It's a really important one. And again, it comes more from the EDI literature than it does from IB. I mean, that's often called passing, right? When someone passes for a different race than they really are. And they're treated differently. And I would say it depends on the theoretical mechanisms you're looking at. So, I commonly use identity as a theoretical phenomena when I'm explaining things about individuals who are multicultural themselves. And so looking at self-identification, that works, right? Whereas somebody who is looking more at status differentials or power dynamics or interrelationships between people, they might want to look more at how somebody is perceived rather than how they self-identify. And so that's where, matching that measurement to the theoretical mechanism matters so much.
I think it's also very interesting in the sense that when you kind of like self-perception, where does self-perception comes from? Sometimes our self-perception is a reaction to society at large. Like my mother is Welsh, and if we were in Wales and England, that would have been a thing, right? And they consider them kind of a different group, and it becomes more salient. Here, I never think of it. Why would I? So my self-perception is often influenced by my environment at large. So you can't really get away from it in that way. So like, I mean, if somebody's coming from a place where it's not a salient feature, it's just not. But other ones, it can be, and they consciously reject it. And there's a big difference between those two.
Go ahead, Günter.
Again, very important questions. We talked a lot about diversity today, but we didn't talk a lot about inclusion, I think. And, inclusion is a lot about how others see us, and how we are being stereotyped by others. And, especially in the context of migration, right? This is something that migrants face permanently, these xenophobic responses, national stereotypes, and sometimes, they cannot escape them. And then it's interesting to see how they deal with these issues. There are all kinds of, I think, identity defense mechanisms. I think I'm not familiar with identity research, but they are called. And and there's not enough research out there, I think, in the context of teams. There's, I think, quite a lot, fairly large body of work there in the migration field, right? But I think not so much in the context of teams. And that's definitely, a gap in the field.
I agree. I'm just checking. I want to give a shout out to my two research assistants, Rebecca Taylor and Kamal Patel, who are also listening right now. And they had a really interesting article that we found this summer that was not about, was not international. So I'll find the reference and I'll share it. It's really interesting. I think it's a great question that we don't yet have answers to, but we need them. And I think the EDI field in general is much more comfortable looking at questions of power and asynchronies and identity threats. But I don't yet think they actually have answers about how to measure and how to address these questions. There are actually some good theories there, but not necessarily good measurements and good ways of incorporating the measurements into what do we do about it. There was a really interesting article that I'll put the link on that once we get it, that looked at status of people within a multi-ethnic team, but they actually measured status by doing another survey to a bunch of people asking for relative status of the groups. So they did both self-identified status and society-identified status in the same study. So it's a really interesting methodology. I think one of the things that was important for this conversation too is that it was highly contextualized, right? You couldn't just take their numbers about perceived status and use those same numbers even in a different region, right? Because they're very embedded in the social context right there. And so I think from a methodological perspective, it offered some interesting answers. But as I said, I think the EDI field asks the right questions and has some of the right ideas, and also needs some of our understanding to move forward about how to look at the effects of all of these.
Your follow-up, Günter?
Yeah. Can I come back to the issue of inclusion for a second? Because I just remembered, in our 2010 meta-analysis, we had this really puzzling finding that, geographically dispersed teams had less conflict and more social integration than co-located teams. And in our paper, we offer several explanations. I think none of them really convincing. Martha wasn't. And when Martha and I, started working on the retrospective, we talked to a friend, Josephine van Santen, who was Shell's chief diversity officer. And she said, that makes complete sense to me. Because in co-located teams, you often have this typical in-group behavior, right? So very often there's a dominant, group. So at a company like Shell, it would be the Dutch, and the British, basically, and it's often coupled with gender. So it's the British and Dutch males who form the in-group, and everyone else is treated as the outcome, right? So they are not invited to after work drinks, right? Or the in-group members, they go playing golf, etc., etc. And you probably have less of this behavior in geographically dispersed teams. So to her, that made complete sense. So I think also, when we talk about what are the specific challenges facing virtual teams, remote teams, we have to look at issues of inclusion and exclusion and this whole dynamics.
Thanks, Günter. Yeah, there are a couple of follow-up questions actually related. There was a perfect segue from our audience. One of those really important, I think, for us to address before we sign off, and that is how have organizations used the information from this research to form teams or to enhance team effectiveness in order to limit process losses? So to what extent has the meta-analyses and follow-up work been influential in practice? And I'm sure you've got some great examples of how that's been the case. Who wants to answer that? Günter maybe, or Martha?
I'm so sorry. I was just putting that article in the chat.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So good. So Günter, go first, and then I'll figure it out. Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, it doesn't seem to have impacted practice. Because when you look at what's going on in practice, and when we reviewed the literature, we also reviewed the more practitioner-oriented literature, including consultancy reports, right? So that there's this overwhelming, feeling that diversity is only a good thing, And for instance, the McKinsey report, 2020 report, is titled Diversity Wins. There's all this talk about the wonderful synergies that come from diversity and how, creating a more diverse workforce will help you outperform your competitors, etc. This is, of course, complete nonsense. That's naive to believe. So, the idea, the insight that diversity is a double-edged sword seems to have been completely lost on consulting firms. I know only one type of organization where you can find a direct effect from diversity on profitability, and that's consulting firms. It's a big business for them. So unfortunately, what we can see is apparently our work at least didn't have a big impact on that.
Yeah. Okay. And Tuga gave me the question too. Yeah. I agree, right? And I present our research frequently in companies, and they're shocked, right? Because it's not what they've heard from the consultants. And they actually love it because what we're presenting is so much closer to their lived experience that it's a relief to them, because when the consultants say diversity is good, diversity wins, they feel like they've been doing something wrong all their careers. Because that's not quite, sometimes, yeah, but sometimes no. So they feel like they've been doing something wrong. And so, when you present the more nuanced research and of course the updates of it, they kind of go, oh, phew, then we can focus on how. And the other thing that really worries me in the practical side where they haven't quite got it yet is they still ask a little too often, what does this mean for how I should compose my teams? And, the answer is you should compose your teams the way you need to compose your teams. You should compose them for the task, for the networks, and then you should take it, and yes, you should compose them with diversity. But if you're matching up categories of diversity with knowledge bases that you need, then you're really only valuing people on the team for that one specific part of who they are, not for everything that they bring. So it's really kind of a backwards way to look at it. And not that you shouldn't look at diversity, but it's not the only thing you should look at. So I think practice should focus much more on these mediators and moderators. When I talk with line managers, they get it. It's the consultants and some HR, not all, but some HR that have a harder time with these messages.
Yeah,
Piers, were you gonna? Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yep.
This is actually more when you're getting right down the organization. It's PO fit, really, right? It's and now you're talking about supplementary versus complementary. People bringing in different things, different skills to the organization. And then you're kind of looking at, you even get directionality in here to go back to it if you take a polynomial regression viewpoint. This is really, interesting and fascinating. I mean, then because there's really two sides of this. One thing is a social justice issue. It's good, for example, to have a police force reflects the community. The other one is, who should I get to actually, be this? Should I just do it completely in a meritocracy? And meritocracy may reflect past systematic issues if people didn't have access to education. And so you're kind of, and you're trying to balance these things out. It's really great when diversity, social justice, and diversity and performance come together. And, everyone's happy. It's win-win-win. But when it doesn't, it becomes, it becomes, well, how are we going to deal with this? And a lot of people don't like the fact of values pluralism, which is basically individual things can be good, yet incompatible with each other or go against each other. And we do not like to have discussions about those trade-offs.
Thank you, Piers. Thanks. There's one last question that I want to sneak in. Klaus, am I allowed one more question? Okay, good. I see we're right about our time limit, but we do have some members of the audience that are very interested in the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic and the massive increase in remote work that we're seeing. And curious in particular, this is from Rachel Chang. Will we see a decrease in cultural diversity in virtual teams in some national cultures? And then I would just extrapolate from that and say, what is the impact of the pandemic on cultural diversity in teams? Is it reducing the effect of cultural diversity, increasing it, having no effect? Are we dealing with it in a more functional way, in a healthier way? Would anyone like to comment on that?
I think so. In our article too, we updated the literature, at least to a certain extent, on global virtual teams. So combining both culture and technology dispersion. The interesting thing is both culture and dispersion and being virtual tend to have the same kind of impact on teams. So if you manage them well, they can lead to positive impact. And if you don't manage them well, they can decrease it, right? So they've got both positive and negative effects. And the combination can be more positive or less positive. And so the global virtual teams that are managing both cultural diversity and virtuality well, I think are seeing real benefits from it right now. And before, when they thought they had to get on an airplane, there were more tensions. And if they're managing it well now, they're realizing how much more they can do virtually. And I hope that will continue. On the other hand, teams that are not managing those dynamics well are seeing real negative effects, bigger differences, bigger schisms bigger fault lines, right, between all the different groups. So I think it's just exacerbating the kind of polarization of performance patterns.
That's an interesting insight, Martha. Others that want to contribute on that issue? I could just add that what I've been seeing is this common threat, this common concern and emotional experience has bound together people in ways that I have never seen before in my career or my life. People from very different walks of life, people from different cultures, different organizations. So I'm hoping that as we move into post-pandemic situation, that much of that sentiment will remain, that we will continue to unify, work together, identify common goals in a way that we hadn't before. And it will actually have a positive impact on the future of work. So I think I will thank our panelists for their wonderful reflections at this point. And I know that Klaus had a few final words that he wanted to say, but just thank you so much, Stacey, Martha, Günter, Piers, for being here with us today. And thank you to all the audience members for your wonderful questions. It's been a real pleasure moderating this session for you. Klaus?
Thank you, Cristina. Thank you, everyone, for the great webinar we had. I love the energy that's in this room. I can feel the passion of all the speakers, but also the passion actually in the Q&A, even though our participants only have the way of asking questions. The questions are very insightful. So that basically means, from a journal perspective, I expect a lot of more research happening in this area. We hope to see that in print sooner or later. There is, of course, one specific opportunity that was mentioned by Cristina earlier, which relates to the special issue that has a deadline next year, actually 1 year from now. And if you do research in the challenges of mobility of people related to COVID, that would actually fit this very well. Global mobility of people closely overlaps with cross-cultural teams research. And by the way, Dana put it in the chat, there was a very good editorial on recently on human resource management, international human resource management, and the need for further research in that area. With that, I thank all the contributors. And last but not least, I want to draw your attention to our next webinar, which is 2 weeks from today, exactly in the same time slot. We will look at the social impact of M&Es operating in developing countries. So we'll talk about things like inequality, labor standards, wages, and things like that. A very different topic, but I think it's also a very hot topic. Thank you, everyone.